Fear. The oldest story ever told. Before we had cities, before we had books, even before we had language, we had fear. The sound of a twig snapping in the dark, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, that feeling when you feel like somebody's watching you. From the very beginning of storytelling, humans have found a way to recreate fear. We've painted it on cave walls and whispered it through myths and legends of our cultures. We've written it into novels, and in the past century, we've projected it onto giant screens where we sit shoulder to shoulder in the dark, paying to be afraid. But why? Why do we seek out the very thing that we spend our lives trying to avoid? Why do we walk into movie theaters asking directors to show us our greatest fears on big screens? To get to the bottom of this, we must understand the psychology of fear. Let's start with the basics. Obviously, fear is survival. Our brains evolved to detect threats, and fear is the alarm system that tells us whether to be in fight or flight. Fear sharpens our senses, it pumps us full of adrenaline, and sometimes it even makes us hyper-focused. And that's exactly why a jump scare works. That's why music that creates tension makes your heart race before anything even happens. It's like a simulation of danger, but deep down, you know you're safe. It's like being on a roller coaster. Your body is screaming for help, but your brain knows that you're strapped in. This is called benign masochism. We like horror movies for the same reason we like spicy food. They hurt, but in a way we can control. They give us just enough of that danger signal to feel alive without any of the real consequences. But another really interesting thing about horror movies that I've personally realized after watching them for so many years, and everyone around me being really confused as to why I love creepy things so much. And it's not just that I love creepy things, it's that horror movies actually make me feel seen. They often externalize things that I would keep buried. It points at the monster inside of us. It points at fear of death, fear of losing control, fear of the unknown, fear of ourselves. And that's why horror movies resonate so deeply with me. They force me to confront things that I probably would have avoided on day-to-day basis. But here's where it gets interesting. The fears we see on the big screen are not random. Every generation has its own genre of horror movies because every generation and every era has had its own anxieties. In the 1930s, the world was staggering under the Great Depression, with fascism rising across Europe. So what dominated screens? Gothic monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, allegories for fear of the outsider, fears of science going too far, fears of death that felt very real in a decade defined by poverty and instability. Now we jump to the 1950s, the Cold War. Suddenly, horror shifts. Nuclear fears, radiation, aliens. Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers spoke to the paranoia about communism and conformity and the idea that your neighbor could suddenly be an enemy. And then the 70s came, a world reeling from the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the public growing distrust in authority. Horror became dirty, grimy, and chaotic. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes tapped into the sense that the world itself was untrustworthy. It was about the horror hiding in the back roads or in your basement or places that no one was really looking. Then came the 80s, my personal favorite, and in my opinion, the golden era of horror films. Slashers exploded. Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. And even though Halloween wasn't a part of this because technically it was released in 1978, it was the tail end of the 70s, and I still kind of count this because it does have a lot of, in my opinion, the themes that I'm going to be talking about in the 80s. So technically, in my head, it's a part of this one. But in the 80s, horror leaned into blood and into spectacle and, in general, over-the-top behaviors. This was the Reagan era, the MTV era. Consumerism was booming and everything was dialed up to 11, and horror reflected that. embracing sequels, franchises, and killers and villains who were attached to these franchises who got super famous. But also, the 80s were shadowed by the AIDS crisis. So slashers were almost a morality tale in disguise. Sex and drugs and fun, they all come with a price. We often saw these franchisable villains attacking babysitters and teenagers who were partaking in lustful and sinning behaviors. The 90s, meanwhile, pulled back from all of this. The cynicism of this decade brought horror films like Scream, films that mocked the genre while also revitalizing it at the same time. Horror was suddenly self-aware, aware that the audience wasn't buying the same old tropes. And then the 2000s happened, and it kind of got darker from here. Post 9/11 horror shifted into torture and extreme survival. Films like Saw and Hostel. And it might just seem like it was just gore for gore's sake, but in a way, it was also affecting a culture that was obsessed with security, surveillance, torture, terrorism, and loss of control. The fear was no longer monsters and vampires in the shadows. It was waking up, chained in a basement, your life in the hands of someone else's ideologies. Which leads us to now, the modern wave. And I think a good example of the modern wave is the movie Weapons. I went to go see Weapons recently, and oh my gosh, if you haven't gone to see it, go see that movie. Is fantastic. But I found myself fascinated with not only the story, but the undertones of the story. And I was thinking in the movie, how does this relate to now? And what I came up with is the film was trying to describe is how communities unravel in the face of violence and grief. Just like how Get Out reflected racial anxieties, which is a huge part of what's going on right now in the world, or how Hereditary mirrored familial trauma. Weapons was, to me, tackling the collective trauma of mass shootings or a collective trauma, something that has been going on a lot recently in the world. Tragedies that these families and communities have to go through every single year. And I thought it was so special that that movie was able to capture the feeling of grief and a community being shattered and not being able to speak up for yourself. That was a huge theme of that movie. Hugely recommend that movie, by the way. Amazing, fantastic. 10 out of 10. But fear is also very personal. Directors also bring their own obsessions, their own childhood traumas, and their own nightmares into their work. And that's why horror films often feel so disturbingly intimate. Take Ari Aster's Hereditary. On the surface, it's a supernatural film about demons, but at its core, it's about grief, and it's about family trauma, and the fear of inheriting pain through the people who raised us. And for most, that is a very real trauma. Or look at Jordan Peele's Get Out. It's scary, yes, but what makes it terrifying is the fear that it's rooted in something that's very real. Systemic racism and microaggressions. The fear of being trapped in a world that doesn't see your humanity. And what's so special about this film is that Jordan Peele made that fear unavoidable in the movie, forcing audiences who'd rather ignore that have to look at it. And maybe that's why horror movies are the genre that sticks with me the most, because it makes me personally see the fears that I've been carrying all along without even knowing. And it also makes me aware of other people's fears who maybe I don't have the same fear as them, but theirs are very valid as well. Fear evolved with us, and cinema evolved right beside it. Early films leaned into the fear of the other, the fear of disease or the supernatural, like Nosferatu, the original, with its ghastly vampire representing foreignness, plague, and death all at once. And the same with Godzilla. It represented a mushroom cloud. It was the fear of annihilation, of man's creation turning against him. And I just love how directors have always tapped into whatever cultural wounds were most raw at the time. For example, The Sunken Place. It isn't scary because it's necessarily violent, but it's scary because of what it represents. The loss of agency, the fear of being silenced, erased. Jordan Peele uses visual language to tap into centuries of racial trauma. And what I love about Jordan Peele films the most is that directors like him don't just make us jump. They also make us think about why we jumped in the first place. But also, This is the paradox of horror. Why do we as humans willingly expose ourselves to fear, especially when it is going on in the real world? Personally, I think catharsis. Aristotle talked about tragedy purging emotions, giving us a safe place to feel what we otherwise would have suppressed. Horror does this with fear and anxiety. In a world where everything feels uncertain, politics, climate change, pandemics, horror offers a controlled environment to confront those feelings. So when a director shows us our greatest fears, they're in a way giving us tools. Horror teaches us to recognize fears, how to sit with it, how to process it. In a way, horror is practice for life. In a way, they're saying, I see the thing that terrifies you, and it terrifies me too. And in a weird parasocial way, it comforts me. And through the decades, our fears and our monsters may be different, but the feeling of fear is our most universal language, a feeling that everybody knows. Every decade, every culture, horror reinvents itself to best fit the societal pressures of that generation. But we all have one thing in common. We are all scared of something. Anyways, hi, I'm Isabella, and thank you for listening and joining me today. If you guys couldn't tell, I love horror. I love psychological thrillers. I love anything spooky, scary, skeleton. Look at this. Do you guys like my blanket? Spirit Halloween is opening up, I'm pretty sure, this week, and they had to have known. It's a birthday present to me. They had to have known. Spirit Halloween is opening for me. Hope everybody knows that. I will be buying out the entirety of Spirit Halloween, so my dream is for my room to have everything creepy in it. So creepy, VHS, and 80s are the 3 key words of Isabella. Anyways, if you liked today's video, you should hit that like button because it really helps me out. Anyways, like always, if you had fun this week, you should subscribe because I do post new videos every other Monday. Anyways, love ya, great to see ya, and I'll see you next time. Bye!